stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Hey, Hazards, Michael Braithwaite here from Blue Door. Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. We always have amazing guests, and today is no exception. Before I get to that guest, just a reminder, this podcast is brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door, where I work across Peel, York, and Durham, just north of Toronto. We do amazing work and have for over 40 years, serving our most vulnerable, helping them with housing, healthcare, getting them into well-paying jobs that lift them out of poverty in our Construct program, and much, much more. Hats off to the over 100 people working so hard, the frontline heroes there that are doing great work. And in partnership with the Canadian Alliance on Homelessness, hey, you know what? They just released, and by the time you get this, it will be kind of old news, but they did release all their different speakers that are going to be at their conference in Halifax in the fall. Check it out. What a lineup, man. Like crazy. We're going to have a lot of them on the show before to chat about what all the stuff they're doing. So it's really cool. Check that out and much more. They have all sorts of different resources and ways that they could get involved in your community and help you become a Built for Zero community. Go to caeh.ca and check that out. And if you want to check out Blue Door and some of the cool stuff we're doing, go to bluedoor.ca. Awesome. Well, let's talk about today's guest. Today, I have Jacq Brasseur, and Jacq is a consultant, a researcher, an educator, an advocate from a young age too, and they've won all sorts of awards for that. And we talk a lot about Jacq's career path. Jacq grew up in Yellowknife and now resides in Saskatchewan. We talk a little bit about what does homelessness look like in Yellowknife. It looks a little different in the north and how people support each other, some of the challenges there. We talk about why advocacy for the 2S LGBTQ plus community is so important. We talk about the rise, unfortunately, although we see this awesome groundswell of support across the country through all of these different pride parades and events, there's still a groundswell, unfortunately, of hate and harassment that we see coming from our neighbors in the south and into parts of eastern Canada. And we talk about why that's happening, what we can do to stem that, and much, much more. Why there's a need for specific housing programs for 2S LGBTQ plus youth, like we have in York Region called Inclusion, IN Inclusion, and Alberta. Others are running that as well with host homes programs. But, why is there a need for those? And we talked about the program that they started with the University of Regina when they were working at a nonprofit there. It's a great conversation, really rich, and it's so interesting. This podcast is about education, awareness, and growing that. And we do that and more. Jacq is a great guest, phenomenal, and really, really fun and interesting. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's go to that conversation on the way home.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Michael. Really excited for the conversation today.
Yeah, I'm excited about it as well. We always do like a pre-chat, listeners, before we get on here. And aside from the questions I thought I'd have, there's many, many more. So eager to get on with the conversation. But before I do, we ask everyone the same question that comes on the show, because it's a little personal to everyone who comes on, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, home is so deeply tied to where I grew up, where I was born and raised in Yellowknife. Yellowknife will always be home to me, even if I don't live there full time. But the thing about the North, and I'm hoping that sort of listeners who are also from Northern communities can speak to this, is that there's sort of this like unconditional sense of just care and support and love of you take care of each other, even if you hate them, even if you think that like what they're doing is bad, or that they're you don't get along with them. You just take care of them, and you have that responsibility. And I think that that's why we see in Yellowknife, we've seen situations of people's homes burning down and raising like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, Yellowknife's a city of like 20,000 people. Like, so to raise that kind of money, but I think that to me is really, when I think about home, those are the things I think about, of like unconditional love, of feeling safe and protected. And I think that home, in terms of as a city, right, and sort of feeling like a place is home, like a city is home for me. I think that a physical home, or sort of when we talk about our home with our family, or that's sort of a microcosm of that. Like, when we think about houselessness or homelessness, um, being people can have homes without having houses, and people can be in houses without having a home, because it might not include those things like unconditional love and protection and care. And so when I think about home, for me, that's what it means: feeling safe and loved unconditionally, and being able to live as my authentic self in my community.
Amazing. And I love what you're saying there about community. One of the mistakes that I've made over the course of my career with some organizations is we are so eager to house people, when we forget about the community part, and they don't have a sense of community, they may end up back in emergency shelter housing, that because they had a sense of community there. They had 25 buddies and staff that cared, and they formed a family, and then we put them out on their own. But yes, you have four walls and a door and a key to your front door, but that sense of community is not there. So fortunately, Jacq, we've grown a little bit, and we learn, and so we have workers afterwards that are really focused on connecting people with community. So love that answer. And let's talk just a little bit about Yellowknife. When you say home, homelessness, and I know you've been clear, saying, look, I'm not an expert, but it's a little different, say, in the north. And I love what you're saying, how people really look, because of, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, is that like the lack of resources, sometimes you're kind of pushed to lean on each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true, but I also think that like housing and home and looks so different in the north. I think, and again, as I said, I'm not an expert on this. There's tons of folks in the Northwest Territories who could probably speak way more as an expert on the conversation of houselessness. But for instance, like, there are people who live out on the land, and they don't have they don't have four walls and a door. They have a tent and fuel, and they live full time on the land, or they have their hunting, they have like their hunting cabin that they live in the winter, and then they live out on the land in tents over the summer. So I mean, I think too, there was a story years ago in Yellowknife with I think it was NWT Housing, or another sort of northern housing organization, like government sort of funding, refusing to fund, somebody didn't pay rent, but they had their own cabin or home that they just needed to heat with fuel. But it wasn't a traditional utility. It wasn't rent. It wasn't a mortgage. And so they argued with the government for a long time to say, no, this is actually how I need you to provide me a home. But I think that the other impacts in the Northwest Territories, and in Yellowknife specifically, is that the majority, I think it's something like 80% of housing, of like rental housing, is owned by the same company. And that company is not northern. That's a company based in, I think, in Alberta. And so you have these smaller landlords. And listen, like, I'm not known as someone who defends landlords very often. But I think that, but I do think that there's work being done by northern people in Yellowknife that I'm familiar with, who are trying to keep ownership of homes, rental units in the north, because to your, as we were talking about community, it's really hard to refuse housing to people when those are the people that you see every day in your community. And so yeah, I mean, I think that houselessness in the Northwest Territories looks very different than it looks in other places. Um, and it's something that I think has informed the way that I see houselessness, and that I see my own responsibility, just as like a person, not even as someone who does housing work, because I don't, just as somebody who lives in community. And people are my neighbors and my community members, whether or not they have a house address or not. And so I think just being in the North has sort of shaped, and my growing up in the North has sort of shaped the way that I understand neighbor or community member. Um, Whereas I think a lot of people sort of think about, like, who has an address in the neighborhood? Well, no, the person who, tents out in one of the alleys behind my house, that person is my neighbor too.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing. Let's talk a little bit about you. And you've won numerous awards, which, I don't mean to embarrass you, but you've won all sorts of awards. I've read that it's in your family history. How the heck did you get into all this work? Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you
Sure.
got started in your advocacy work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I was not raised by people who I knew as advocates. I did not think of my parents as activists. My parents are longtime educators. They were teachers in the Northwest Territories. They moved up to the Northwest Territories from Saskatchewan, which is where I ended up, ironically enough. But they were teachers and principal. My mom was a principal of an elementary school that was one of sort of one of the poorest elementary schools in Yellowknife in terms of like the population of students. My dad was a high school teacher for about 30 years, where he mostly, he taught math for a long time, but then ended up working in like running the independent study program, where overwhelmingly he saw students with unique needs or who couldn't make it work in a traditional classroom. And Yellowknife is a small place. There's only two high schools. There's a Francophone school for K to 12, but sort of the two main high schools. And so I was raised by parents who regularly brought kids home to eat dinner with us, to sleep on our couch, because they didn't have anywhere to go. And I was lucky enough to be raised by parents who I think, and this is sort of when I say, like, I didn't think of them as activists. I just sort of saw them as people living their values, where my parents are incredibly generous people and are thoughtful about what they have and how they can support community members with it. And so, I was raised with just like, we provided food. We fed the kids that didn't have access to food at home. My parents adopted, or sort of fostered, a teenager when I was in high school, and he became my brother. And so seeing sort of this, like, walking the walk, right? And not necessarily just, let's donate money to the homeless shelter, or let's donate money to this cause. It was actually like, how do we open up our home to people? And I think that I was raised with those values, which has now shaped when I thought about what I wanted to do for a living. I originally thought I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to help people, and then I realized that you could help people without having to mark things. And so I decided to go to school to be a social worker, which was a really great experience. I did my training mostly in the Northwest Territories. That program doesn't exist anymore, but at the time there was a social work, sort of a Northern social work training program. But then as I got more into social work, and started to understand more about the ways that social workers have been complicit in a lot of violence against communities, I started thinking, well, like, do I want to work as a social worker at an institution? And so now I'm an unaffiliated social worker. I don't practice social work for any for any organization or community, or like government or community group. But I've chosen to maintain my license because I think that community social workers and just social workers who give back to community is really important. So even as I was a nonprofit executive administrator for a long time, I now run my own business, but I've explicitly sort of chosen to maintain my registration as a social worker because I think that there's that term and that sort of credential like offers a lot of legitimacy in spaces. And so I'm happy to have a number of people in community who call on me when they need an advocate who is unaffiliated with any type of organization, but is still bound by a certain code of ethics. So I don't know. That's a little bit about my story now.
No, it's great. And tell me about the work you're doing now. It's Ivy Dean Consulting, or is it Ivy Plus Dean, or?
Yeah, it's Ivy and Dean Consulting. That's my consulting practice. And I started this practice after working for a decade in the nonprofit sector, mostly within like equity and sort of equity-based nonprofits. I mostly worked in the LGBTQ nonprofit sector and in Saskatchewan, doing that work in Saskatchewan and in the Northwest Territories. And I just found it really frustrating anytime I had to hire a consultant who, if they understood nonprofit stuff and equity, they were often from Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, and they didn't understand my reality doing community work in small places, small and rural places. Or I could hire someone local, but they didn't have my values, right? Saskatchewan is not known as like a very progressive place. So they either like I could hire someone local, but they didn't know my value. They didn't share my values, and they didn't understand the nonprofit sector. They were sort of more generalist. So I decided to start my business a couple of years ago. And when I told some sort of mentors of mine that I wanted to start a consulting practice that was openly queer and openly leftist in Saskatchewan, I was told that I was crazy, and that wouldn't work very well. But there's actually been a lot of people who've sort of offered us open arms, and we've been doing really, really phenomenal work across the province around sort of bringing equity-informed approaches to like nonprofit leadership and programming and governance. So we end up doing a lot of community engagement and consultation with communities for our clients around sort of gauging how they're serving their community and if they're doing that in a way that's meaningful.
Now let's talk a little bit more about that community engagement. You and I were talking pre-podcast around with the groups that when you're trying to engage people without a home, a little bit of a different approach. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what?
Yeah, well, I think that like, traditional consultants, anytime that we do some type of community engagement, people talk about like surveys, right? They're like, oh, let's like, we'll do an online, Zoom discussion group, or we'll host a focus group at this, in this boardroom at this building. And we'll, how are we going to get the word out? We're going to put it on social media, or we're going to put out a press release. But all of those sort of traditional ways of collecting that information are rooted in, I think, an extraction rather than reciprocity and building relationships. And so I think our company, I think my company has found some success in the way that we approach a lot of those things. So one of those things includes the key way that we collect really great information about whether or not an organization is serving its community is through hosting like activities and community events. So we hosted like a free swim night and people came to the swim night and enjoyed the free swimming. But then on their way out, we were like, hey, would you be up for answering some questions here? And so other, hosting like barbecues and free food, and not requiring people to answer questions to get free food, but just inviting people to share. But I think the other thing that we've done is that we often will, my job as a consultant is to translate information. I'm not the expert. It's my job to seek out the experts. And so we engage in a lot of where we'll actually subcontract. I've built some really purposeful relationships with like grassroots activists and organizers where they're a part of my team, and I pay them. Often I pay them to just do the community work that they're already doing. and to invest in their community work, because they have those relationships, and they're not researchers, they're not consultants, that's not their background, they're community activists, they're housing activists or anti-homeless activists, but recognizing that value, that their relationships are what they're bringing. But then we also often I'm not the best positioned person to be like hosting a discussion. And so instead I'm going to go out and I'm going to pay someone who has experience of houselessness, either currently or in the past, to collect that information. And yeah, I'll give them a sort of a guide, right? Here's a couple questions we'd like you to ask, but you also probably know what the best questions are to ask. So we're actually just going to trust you to do that. And then bringing that information, and that allows some anonymity as well. Whereas I think people often assume that like, oh no, we're, like we'll maintain anonymity or confidentiality. But I think so much people who are impacted by poverty and houselessness have been like screwed over for when they're told that it's going to be anonymous, and then it's not, and all of a sudden they've lost their benefits. But I think the last thing that we do is we often pay people not in money, but we ask them what things they might need, because that helps in, so rather than providing a $20 gift card or a $20 $20 cash, we'll say, can we buy you, tell us what pair of pants you want to buy, and we'll go out and purchase those things and compensate people that way, because it doesn't impact people's like benefits, right? Or unemployment or other pieces like that. So I think trying to get creative about those things is an important part of like meeting people where they're at.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a lot of listening, actually, which is good, and involvement. And you're talking about trust there too, right? So many people have been burned, so the trust isn't there. And in many cases, because people have been involved in coming out of care, and the people that were supposed to care about them the most did not. So there's some real trust issues there for sure. Often when we do, so I'll tell you about in York Region, we had not one but two awesome research projects around the needs of 2S LGBTQ plus youth. One from Seneca College, which was wonderful, and kind of told us that individuals didn't feel safe in the current spaces that were available, and needed specific supports that weren't available, and staff that knew what they're, just had a knowledge base. And then the wonderful Dr. Alex Abramovich did another research project, and it told us many similar things and some new things. And I said I remember saying to my team, like, how much data do we need before we take action? Like, this is great to sit on a shelf. No. So we took action without funding, and thankfully we've got some great funders who stepped up, and we now have a housing program called Inclusion for 2S LGBTQ plus youth. That's a transitional housing program. It's wonderful. It's great. And then we were able to buy the house, so it's there. And I'll tell you, for people who don't think homophobia and transphobia exist still, we were trying to rent a house without really people knowing. It took us a year to find a house and a landlord that would rent, and we were willing to pay a year in advance rent. So alive and well, unfortunately. Now, I tell you about that program because I know you were involved in something called a colorful campus housing program at University of Regina. Talk to me about that program, and why is it important to have programs like our Inclusion and the program, colorful campus housing program?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that program, I started that program when I was the executive director of UR Pride Center, which was an organization that it was a 2S LGBTQ human service agency that provided support both on campus at the university as well as just in community. And so that was part of our campus programming. And part of it was started from my own experience living on campus, in campus housing as a queer and non-binary person. But I think it was really about knowing that it was scary for incoming students who maybe were coming from a place that was inclusive, right, from their home, or and into a potentially uninclusive place, or people who were coming from a home that was not safe, coming into potentially a new home that was also not safe. And so we worked with, I approached the University of Regina at the time and said, this is what I want to do. And because we know that LGBT young people are more likely to be living in poverty, we also want to provide them subsidized housing. And so my initial proposal to the university was, we're going to put some money behind this. We want to rent from you. We'll pay the full rate, and then we'll sort of charge a lower rate to the people that we sublet to. And the university at that time, it was actually pretty incredible. I didn't expect it. They actually said, well, no, we don't want you to spend your own money. We'll provide everybody who's accepted into that housing with a housing bursary. And so then they provided a $1,000 housing bursary to everybody who was accepted into that housing unit. But we talked about a lot of things. I mean, like, I remember when we were talking about where the housing would be, they wanted to put it in a building that shared space with the police college. And the question was, we know that a lot of LGBT people have experienced police violence. How do you feel about that? And do we need to find another place? We talked about, do we want people to know where where the unit is? Because that's potentially like out, people might be outed and so there was, I think, some deep consideration from the university, but also some sort of advocacy on our part. And so we were able to provide that safe housing to university students. But I also want to sort of recognize that I think, there's other, and where I live, usually in Regina, Saskatchewan now. And in Saskatchewan, there are two really phenomenal programs operating to support LGBTQ young people. One of those is Lulu's Lodge in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is run by the John Howard Society. And it's a group home for young LGBTQ people. And then there's also the Pride Home in Saskatoon, which I actually think was, one of the first LGBTQ youth group homes in Canada. And those two programs are chronically underfunded. They're not supported very well by provincial government. And they mostly rely on donations and fundraising. But and so I want to sort of give a shout out to the folks doing that work, at both John Howard Society and out Saskatoon. But what was really interesting is that, Ivy and Dean, we recently did a consultation with LGBT people living in the city of Regina. And one of the things that we heard from them was that it's really great that housing programs for young LGBT people exist, but we're seeing a gap for LGBT adults where they can't find safe and affordable housing. And so that work, and I think that work now is sort of being looked at by organizations doing work around houselessness in Regina. But that's still, I think, a big gap where we're seeing a lot of, because I think it's easy to want to fund young people. Easy is maybe too much of a word, but I think funders and even donors, I think, it's not that child's fault that that they're homeless. But I think that often when we think about adults, there's sort of this like deserving versus undeserving poor, and people are, I think, less interested in giving or supporting adult housing programs in the same way. And so I do think that that's one of the major gaps across the country right now, is housing for LGBT people who experience houselessness.
Yeah, and I would agree. It's interesting, aside from the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, when you talk about adults, but even men, right? So in the region of York, in the past 20 years has been wonderful because they've built like first they started with a family emergency housing program, right? Perfect. People had no problem with it. Well, it was not no problem, but it was easier. And then a female, and then a youth. But when it comes to men, that's the last one. I mean, people are going berserk, right? Because homeless, well, it's their own fault. Is there to your point there?
Yeah. Well, and I think that so much of that is also tied to sexism, right? Around just like this idea of like, well, men should be providing, right? And all, without recognizing necessarily how much men, particularly like Indigenous men and men of color and men with disabilities, are really impacted by the same systems that oppress other people at risk of houselessness.
Absolutely, and well said. Now, listen, I'm in Toronto as we speak. And last weekend we had Pride Parade here, It is a massive parade, and you see the support. It's incredible. And you see the support. We talked about Yellowknife had their first. It was small, but the first awesome parade, right? In York Region, we have one. It's well attended. So you see this groundswell of support. It's beautiful. It's amazing across the country, which might lead people to say, well, is advocacy still needed? We still need to keep working forward. And at the same time, as I say that, we see what's happening in the U.S. and some parts of Canada with the hate kind of that seems to be growing as well. And we saw in York Region made national news that school board would not raise the pride flag at their head office, right? With this kind of happening, what are your thoughts around that? Why do you think this is happening, and what can we do? What needs to be done
Yeah.
to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and people I think 6 months ago, Canadian LGBTQ activists were seeing what was happening in the United States, in states like Florida or Texas, or where we were seeing sort of these, these like don't say gay bills, right? That sort of limit the rights for teachers to talk about LGBTQ people in schools. We saw like bans we saw in, I think it was Texas, where the child welfare workers were instructed by the governor to go into files and find parents of trans people, of trans children, to remove trans children from their homes. We saw Florida recently like banning or making efforts to ban. I think that there's some sort of constitutional challenge on that, but trying to ban like gender affirming healthcare for not only for children. They were adamant that it was only about children. Well, now it's about adults too. And LGBT people in Canada and across the world knew that was going to happen. But I think we've all sort of, and I would say probably for even longer than that, like it's been years that I've been hearing particularly trans women in Canada sounding the alarm of like, hey guys, like I'm scared about my rights, and sort of nobody's listening. But yeah, sort of, I remember 6 months ago talking about like, this is going to come to Canada. We need to get ready. And sure enough, the premier of New Brunswick just recently, said a lot of things in their legislative assembly that were like quoted directly from American politicians and American lobbying groups whose goals are to limit rights of LGBT people and to eliminate LGBT people from existence. And I say that was their goal, but in actuality, I think the larger goal here, and why we're seeing so much anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and legislation, is because of the rise of fascism. And that feels alarmist, and that sounds, that maybe sounds overblown, but it's not. Like, there is a direct link between fascism, anti-Semitism, again, between racism and homophobia and transphobia. And that's why when we look at the history, and I think Laverne Cox, an activist in the United States, recently spoke about this on a talk show. She explained that that during when the Nazis rose to power in Germany, one of the first things they did was they burned Magnus Hirschfeld's clinic, which was in the early 1900s. There was more research and information about LGBTQ people, particularly trans people. That was the largest repository of that information, and it all disappeared. And that was because when we look at the way that sort of states or people try to control the populace, we control people by telling them what they can do in their homes, by telling them what they can do at work or out in public. But if they're being controlled at home and in public and in school and at work, the one beacon of hope of control that they have is about their own bodies and about their own experiences and their own identities. And so then there's also a goal to control that too. And so I think that at its core, this is about an attack on controlling the way that people express themselves. And I think that it's important, while I think that we should just care about that because LGBT people, particularly trans people, are just like human beings who deserve protection. I also think that if people believe that the ways that they express themselves are going to be left untouched, like that's not what's going to happen. This is going to get bigger and it's going to snowball. And once they successfully eliminate trans people from the public view, there will be other people impacted by that. And there's going to be, and I think right now, LGBTQ communities, especially transgender women, are being used as a political wedge and a tool to win elections. And we're seeing that. I mean, 8 or 9 years ago, there was photos of Donald Trump carrying a pride flag. You're not going to see that now because he knows and his people know that the way to win an election is to find a community and demonize them. And I think that LGBTQ people, particularly trans women, and particular transgender women of color, are sort of an easy target in that way. And we're seeing the rhetoric around, calling LGBT people pedophiles or groomers or all of these things. Like that was rhetoric we were hearing 30 years ago, and it's coming back. And that's on purpose. And like people are organized about that. And I think that that's really scary.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rise of saying everything like it's the truth without any facts or right information behind it, unfortunately, is on the rise, and it's so true. Throwing those terms around and people just that we're soundbite culture, it's really shameful, and we see that, and it's up to all of us as community members to really to rise and push and be advocates like yourself. So it's so important that you continue the work that you do. We're so grateful for it. Thank you for your time today, for educating us. If people want to find out more about you, about Ivy and Dean, where can they go?
Yeah, well, folks are welcome to find us on LinkedIn. If you're into business Facebook, you can check us out there. But you can also we're on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram at just Jacq Brasseur on Instagram, or Ivy Dean Works is my company. And we're also on Twitter, although Twitter is being harder and harder to be on as an LGBT person nowadays, as we're seeing this rise in hate. So I'm not there as much anymore, but if you're interested, and I mostly tweet about education and because of the work that I do around education in Saskatchewan. But I invite people to check us out, and you can of course always find us online at ivydeanconsulting.ca.
Awesome. Listen, this podcast, when we first were talking to Jacq, he said, look, I'm not professing to be, expert on housing homelessness or to LGBTQ plus homelessness. But this podcast is primarily around education awareness, because we believe more people know and they get the right information, the more they can grow and spread that word, and things can change. Thank you for creating that education awareness today, and for doing that every day in the work you do. It's so appreciated.
Well, thank you so much. I think that resources like this, as we're talking more critically about housing and homelessness, is so important to get more people to recognize that this is a joint effort. And if we want to put an end to houselessness and homelessness, we all have a responsibility in that. And so I think that resources like this and opportunities for people to learn in like an accessible way are so important. So I was really honored to be involved, and I'm happy. I'm happy to come back if ever there's an opportunity to chat more about these conversations.
Absolutely. Jacq, thank you so much for your time today. We'll chat soon.
Thank you so much, Michael.